In what many Muslim nations around the world label as a sign of treason against the Palestinians by the UAE after the signature of a so-called peace deal with the Israeli regime, the first stages of the deal have appeared in the form of a peace flight between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi. On board the El Al flight were several US and Israeli officials, including the son-in-law of the US President, Jared Kushner, one of the main players who is said to have spearheaded the secret talks between the two parties prior to the announcement of the deal. A senior Palestinian official, Hanan Ashrawi, has stated that the flight, deal and fanfare surrounding the agreement is nothing more than a puppet show, and has stated that Arab leaders involved in the deal are no more than actors in a poorly executed White House play. However, the arrival of red carpets and flying flags was not the only welcome that Flight Lima Yankee 971 was privy to, as explosions hit the UAE capital of Abu Dhabi, killing 2 and injuring others, whilst another rocketed Dubai, also killing 1 and injuring more. A coincidence or a sign of things to come? For the UAE, who stated that the explosions were merely gas cylinders in a restaurant, failed to put 2 and 2 together to realise that all the locations were American chain restaurants, with the likes of KFC and others all succumbing to the fatal explosions. With the United Arab Emirates in a very lonely position when it comes to support from other regional states, the protests that were sparked following the signing of the deal voiced a very clear sign that the normalisation of ties with the Israeli regime is something that will simply not be tolerated, mostly due to the shocking treatment of the Palestinians by the regime, with the likes of the destruction of Palestinian homes, the cutting of supplies and an ongoing blockade being prime examples of Israeli brutality. With the ink yet to dry on the UAE-Israeli deal, already cracks have started to appear. The US rejection of providing the Emirates with F-35 fighter jets has angered the UAE, with Israel demanding that it must have a military edge in the region, which the US, by law, must abide by. Is this also hence a sign of things to come? It hence raises the question as to just why there's so much pushback when it comes to accepting the normalisation of ties between the Israeli regime and the United Arab Emirates.
You see, regarding the restriction of the F-35 sales to the United Arab Emirates, which is the Zionist entity, they were adamant in refusing that. Strategically, the United States of America always stands to give the Zionist entity the upper hands militarily against all the Arab states and even the Islamic world. To ensure the existence and the survival of the Zionist entity.
When Mike Pompeo waltzed around the West Asia region attempting to lobby other Arab nations to follow suit in the deal signed by the Israeli regime and the UAE, little did he think that he would return to Washington empty-handed, as several high-profile US allies blanked his offers and left the Secretary of State very red-faced. Yet the message being sent by the likes of Oman, Bahrain and Sudan, as well as Morocco, Iran, Palestine and others is simple. The normalisation of ties between Arab and other regional nations is simply off the table, hence why the cold reception to the idea appeared to have more support than accepting the idea itself. An analyst from the European Council of Foreign Relations, Hugh Lovett, took it a step further by stating that in spite of the best efforts by the Secretary of State to secure more deals, the pomp and circumstances of Pompeo's visit came as nothing more than an anticlimax to the deal, hence exposing the clear crack and flaws that were riddled across the accord. On top of this, a planned visit to Washington by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman has seen the Saudi regime de facto leader pull out of the visit, quoting the notion that the details of the talks had been leaked in advance. However, it's very clear that bin Salman has much deeper concerns surrounding taking such a step, more likely over the backlash of such a meeting. Could the dropout of bin Salman and the failure by Pompeo to nurture support for the normalisation of ties between Arab states and the Israeli regime hence proved that the failure by the US to gain any momentum in this deal to be a sign of the failing policies in the region by the US, and therefore marked the end of US foreign policy in the region.
The normalization deal between the Zionist entity and UAE sparked and stirred a lot of anger in the Arab and the Islamic world. The Palestinian leadership itself described that deal as a betrayal to the Palestinians and a stab in the back to the struggle of the Palestinian against the Zionist colonization and occupation of Palestine.